You know how a conversation can end a relationship without anyone raising their voice? That's what happened to me on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, 3 years ago. My daughter called not to ask how I was doing, not to check in after my knee surgery 2 weeks earlier. She called to tell me, in the same tone she uses when she's explaining something obvious to someone slow, that it might be better if I didn't come to the holiday this year. Dad, she said, we just think it'd be easier. For everyone. I was standing in my kitchen. I remember because I had just put on a pot of coffee. The smell of it filled the room, and for a moment that smell and her words existed in the same air together, and something about that combination felt deeply wrong, like a song played in the wrong key. I asked her what she meant by easier. She sighed. Not an impatient sigh, worse, a tired one, like she had been rehearsing this and was relieved to finally say it out loud. You know what I mean, Dad. Marcus's family is coming. His parents, his sisters, the cousins. It's going to be a full house, and you just... She paused, choosing her words. You tend to make things uncomfortable. You always have opinions about everything, and sometimes people just want to enjoy a meal. I didn't say anything for a moment. It's one holiday, she said. You can come at Christmas. I told her I understood. I told her to have a good time. I set the phone down on the counter next to the coffee maker, poured myself a cup, and stood there at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard, where the oak tree I planted the year my son was born had gone completely bare, every leaf gone. The branches looked like cracks in gray glass. I had opinions. That was the charge. 38 years as a structural engineer, 2 decades teaching at the university level, a career spent calculating how much weight a thing could hold before it broke, and my daughter's summary of me was that I had opinions. I want to be fair. I wasn't a perfect father. I worked long hours when my kids were small. I missed recitals and soccer games and the kind of dinners that become memories. My wife Sandra held the family together in ways I didn't fully understand until she was gone. When she died 6 years ago, I think my children grieved her, and also, quietly, began to realize how much of their warmth toward me had passed through her first. She was the translator between my way of being in the world and theirs. Without her, we were 3 people who loved each other in a language none of us spoke fluently anymore. So I understood the call. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. The Tuesday after that Sunday, I drove to the university to collect the last of my things from my old office. I had officially retired 8 months earlier, but kept delaying the final trip. There's something about seeing your name taken off a door that makes retirement feel less like freedom and more like erasure. My graduate student, a sharp young woman named Priya, who I'd supervised through her dissertation, helped me carry 2 boxes to my car. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way young people look at old men who say they're fine with a specific combination of kindness and disbelief. That afternoon I came home and sat in my study, and I looked at the legal pad on my desk where I'd been making notes for the past 14 months. I need to explain what those notes were, because this is the part that matters. 40 years ago, when I was a young engineer working on municipal infrastructure projects, I developed a set of principles for load-bearing analysis in retrofit construction, specifically for older buildings being modernized to meet new seismic codes. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody writes magazine articles about retrofit seismic compliance, but I had a methodology that worked, that was faster and more accurate than the standard approach, and I had spent years refining it. The firm I worked for at the time owned the work I did on the clock, and they licensed it in a limited way to a few contractors. When I left to go into academia, I let it go. I thought it was behind me. Then, 14 months before that Thanksgiving call, I got a letter forwarded from my old firm. They had been acquired twice over the years, and somewhere in the acquisition paperwork my methodology had been transferred and essentially shelved. The new parent company wasn't using it, wasn't licensing it, and under a clause in my original contract that nobody had apparently read carefully, if the methodology went unused for more than 15 years, certain rights reverted to me. A lawyer friend named Thomas Greer read the letter and told me it was real. He told me to be careful, to document everything, and not to tell anyone until we knew what we had. So for 14 months, I didn't tell anyone. Not my daughter, who was busy planning her life with Marcus. Not my son, who had moved to Denver and called me on birthdays and sometimes Father's Day. Not my colleagues at the university. I sat in my study with my legal pad and my old notes and my laptop, and I rebuilt the entire framework. Not just the original methodology, but everything I had learned in 40 years of application. I updated it for modern building materials, for the computational tools that didn't exist when I first developed it, for the new seismic data from research done in the past decade. What had been a working process became something much more complete, a system, a platform that could be adapted into software. I am not a software engineer. I cannot write code, but I knew what the system needed to do, and I knew how to document it with enough precision that someone who could write code would understand exactly what to build. Thomas helped me file the updated patent applications. We engaged a technology consultant, a meticulous man named Russell Park, who had spent 20 years in construction tech and immediately understood what I had. Russell was the one who told me to stop thinking of it as a methodology and start thinking of it as infrastructure for the next generation of building compliance software. You didn't just solve the problem once, he told me over coffee in October. You built the map so anyone can solve it. That's different. That's valuable in a completely different way. I asked him how valuable. He was quiet for a moment. Let me make some calls, he said. My son called me the week of Thanksgiving to say, Happy Thanksgiving. It was a brief call. He was heading to a friend's place in the mountains, he said. Lots of people. It was going to be a good time. He didn't ask about my plans. I told him to have fun. He said he would. I spent Thanksgiving alone. I want to say that clearly, not for sympathy, but because I think the specific texture of that day matters. I made myself a real meal, not a sad can of soup, not delivery. I roasted a small chicken, made stuffing from scratch, opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for a reason I couldn't remember anymore. I ate at the dining room table, which is large enough to seat 10, and I sat in my usual chair, and I ate my dinner, and I read a book, and I listened to the house settle around me, the way old houses do in November, when the temperature drops. It was not the worst day of my life. It was not even close to the worst day. The worst day was the morning Sandra didn't wake up. Compared to that morning, every other bad day is just inconvenience dressed up as grief. But sitting at that table, I thought about the call from my daughter. I thought about the tired sigh. I thought about all the holidays when I had been present and present had not been enough. And I thought about the years I had been absent and how that had made me, in my children's memory, into a person who was difficult by nature, as though the difficulty were a permanent character trait rather than a phase of a longer story. After dinner, I went to my study and I worked. That's what I did. That's what I had been doing for 14 months. And that night, alone on Thanksgiving, I finished the final section of the documentation. Everything was in order. The patent filings were in process. Russell had made his calls. The next morning, Russell called me at 7:15. He said he needed to meet with me in person, and the way he said it careful, level told me the calls had gone well. We met at a coffee shop downtown. He brought a folder. He set it on the table and looked at me for a moment before he opened it. I sent your documentation to 3 firms, he said. 2 infrastructure software companies and 1 construction tech startup that just closed their Series A. All 3 want to talk. But I want you to understand what you have before we schedule anything, because I don't think you fully appreciate it. I told him to go ahead. The startup, Meridian Build, he said, they've been trying to solve the retrofit compliance problem for 2 years. They have a team of 12 engineers, and they've been building from scratch. When their technical lead read your documentation, he called me back in 4 hours. 4 hours, Harold, he said, and I'm going to read this directly. This framework solves every core problem we've been circling for 18 months. This isn't methodology. This is the foundation. I wrap my hands around my coffee cup. They want to license the framework as the core IP for their next product, Russell said. They're raising a Series B. They want your framework to be the technical centerpiece of the raise. That changes your position significantly. I asked him what that meant in terms of numbers. He told me. I sat with that number for a long moment. Outside the coffee shop window, downtown was going about its Friday after Thanksgiving business. People with shopping bags, a couple walking a dog, a city bus pulling away from the stop. I need you to understand, Russell said, that this is a licensing deal. You retain ownership. This isn't a sale. I nodded slowly. Harold, are you hearing me? I'm hearing you, I said. The number I just told you is the initial licensing fee. The royalty structure on top of that, once the product launches, could be significantly larger over 5 to 10 years. I asked him when Meridian wanted to meet. They want to fly you out to San Francisco in 2 weeks, he said, but they also said, if you preferred, they'd come to you. Their words, we'll go wherever he is. I had opinions, my daughter had said. I chose the meeting in San Francisco. Thomas came with me for the legal work, and Russell was there as my technical translator when the engineering conversations got into areas outside my specific expertise. The Meridian team was younger than I expected. Their CEO was 34. Their technical lead, 31. They were not the kind of people I had spent my career around. They spoke in a cadence I had to adjust to, fast and assumption-heavy, always 3 steps ahead of the sentence they were finishing. But when they talked about what my framework could do, when they pulled up their existing codebase on a screen and showed me where my principles fit into their architecture like a key sliding into a lock, I felt something I hadn't felt since the early years of my career. The specific satisfaction of having built something that holds. We spent 2 days in San Francisco. On the evening of the second day, after the term sheet had been reviewed, and Thomas had made his notes, and we had agreed in principle on the structure of the deal, the CEO, his name was Nathan, walked me out to a terrace overlooking the bay. The light was going golden over the water. Can I ask you something? He said. I told him to go ahead. You developed the original methodology 40 years ago, and then you spent 14 months rebuilding it, updating it, completing it. What made you do it now? Why not 10 years ago? Why not 20? I thought about that question. I thought about it honestly. I had other things I thought were more important, I said. I was wrong about what was important, and I was wrong about how much time I had to be wrong. He nodded like that meant something to him. The deal closed on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of December. I was in Thomas's office when the wire transfer confirmed. I sat in a leather chair across from Thomas's desk, and Thomas poured 2 glasses of scotch, and we didn't say very much. There wasn't much to say. We had done the work, and the work was done, and the number in my account was real. I drove home. I made dinner. I sat in my study. My daughter had mentioned Christmas. You can come at Christmas, she had said, as though Christmas were a consolation prize being offered to a child who didn't make the team. I had not called her since Thanksgiving. She had not called me. That silence between us had its own weight, its own specific texture. It wasn't anger on my side. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. It was the settling of a fact that I had been told who I was in her eyes, and I had heard it, and I was now in the process of deciding what to do with that information. I did not want revenge. I want to be clear about that, because I think people, when they hear a story like this, assume the man must have been calculating, must have been storing up his success to throw in his family's face. That's not what happened. I wasn't thinking about my daughter when I worked. I wasn't thinking about her call when I sat in Nathan's terrace looking at the bay. I was thinking about the work, about what it meant that a framework I had carried in my head for 4 decades had finally become what it was always meant to be. That feeling had nothing to do with her. But facts are facts, and facts have a way of traveling. The announcement came out on a Friday evening. Meridian issued a press release about their Series B funding, $47 million raised, and in the release, they described their core IP framework and named me as the originating engineer. 2 technology journalists wrote pieces about it over the weekend. One of them described my methodology as the structural backbone of what could become the industry standard for retrofit compliance software. The piece ran in a publication that covered the construction tech space. A few thousand readers. Not viral by any standard, except that my son's college roommate worked in that space, and he texted my son the article on Sunday night with a message my son later read to me verbatim. Hey, isn't this your dad? Holy S. My son called me at 11:47 p.m. I was not asleep. I am 63 years old, and I sleep badly, and I had been sitting in my study reading when the phone rang. I looked at the screen. His name, 11:47 p.m. "Dad," he said, and the word came out strange, compressed. "Dad, I need to ask you something." I told him to go ahead. Ryan just sent me an article from Build Tech Weekly about a company called Meridian, and there's a section in it I could hear him reading or scrolling. It says, the company's platform is built on a proprietary load analysis framework developed by retired structural engineer Harold Kane, whose decades of applied research in retrofit seismic compliance provided the technical foundation for Meridian's core product. "Dad," he stopped. "Is that you?" I told him it was. Silence. Not a short silence. "Dad," he said again, differently this time, like the word had been deflated and then reinflated. I asked him what he wanted to know. "What?" He stopped. "Tried again. When did this happen? How long have you been working on this?" I told him roughly 14 months, but that the original framework was 40 years old. More silence. Then, "And you didn't tell us?" I thought about how to answer that. I told him the truth, that Thomas had advised discretion until the deal was finalized, and that I had followed that advice. "But it's done now," he said. "The deal is done." I told him it was. The article says. He stopped. I could hear something in his breathing change. "Dad, can I ask what the deal was worth?" "You don't have to tell me. I told him the initial licensing number. I did not mention the royalty projections." He was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, quietly, "Jesus, Dad." I told him it had been a good few months. He laughed. It was a surprised laugh, short and a little helpless, and there was something in it that cracked something in me, a small crack, the kind that doesn't break a thing but changes it. Because it was the laugh of a man realizing he had been wrong, not caught in a lie or exposed in a cruelty, just wrong, in the quieter way. The way you're wrong when you assume you understand something you never looked at closely enough. "I need to call Claire," he said. "Claire is my daughter." I told him he could do whatever he wanted. I told him it was late and I was going to go to bed. "Dad," he stopped again. Whatever he was trying to say, he couldn't locate it in real time. I knew the feeling. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said finally. "Okay? Can we talk tomorrow?" I told him that would be fine. I set the phone down on my desk and sat with the quiet for a while. My study is a small room, books on 3 walls. Sandra's photograph on the shelf between a dictionary and a collection of frost. The lamp in the corner that gives everything a yellow light. I sat in that yellow light and I thought about my son's voice on the phone. I thought about the moment when I heard his assumption break. The assumption that his father was simply who he had appeared to be, no more and no less. A retired man with opinions and time on his hands, and nothing very consequential going on. I thought about how long I had been that person in their eyes, and I thought about how I had let it happen, not entirely their fault, not entirely mine. 2 people can be wrong about each other for years, without either one being a villain. That's one of the things I learned from Sandra. She was a generous interpreter of human behavior. She always assumed that the gap between what someone did and what they meant was wider than it appeared. She gave that gap room to breathe. I wasn't as good at that. I filled gaps quickly, with conclusions. Maybe my son had filled a gap with me. Maybe my daughter had, and maybe I had filled gaps with them. 2 had decided I knew what kind of children they'd become before they'd finished becoming it. My daughter called me the next morning at 8:15. She did not wait for pleasantries. "Dad," she said, and I could hear in her voice that she'd been awake for a while. "James told me what he saw. The article. He said there's a deal." I told her that was right. "Why didn't you tell us?" Her voice was careful, measured, trying very hard to stay on the right side of something. I thought about answering that question directly. Then I thought about the Sunday call, the tired sigh, the specific phrasing. "You tend to make things uncomfortable." I thought about the Thanksgiving table I had sat at alone, and the oak tree in the backyard, and the coffee that was still brewing when she told me not to come. "I had my reasons," I said. A long pause. "Are you angry at me?" I told her honestly that I wasn't sure. that angry wasn't quite the right word for what I was feeling. I told her what I felt was more like clarified, like something that had been cloudy had settled, and what was left was clearer than it used to be, which was useful even if it wasn't entirely comfortable. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. The careful, measured quality was gone. "I shouldn't have told you not to come," she said. I don't know what I thought, that it would be simpler, that Marcus's family wouldn't have to deal with." She stopped. "That's not a good enough reason. I knew it wasn't when I said it. I just said it anyway." I told her I appreciated her saying that. "Dad." Another pause, long and textured. "Are you okay? Not the deal, not the article. You, are you okay?" I thought about that question. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinner I had made myself. The chicken, the stuffing, the wine, the book, the bare oak tree. I thought about the yellow lamp in my study, and the 14 months of quiet work, and the afternoon in San Francisco when a 31-year-old engineer showed me where my framework fit into something being built for the future. I told her I was better than I had been in a long time. She exhaled slowly. "I want to see you," she said, "at Christmas, not as a consolation, not because of the deal. I want to see you because you're my father and I miss you, and I think I've been lazy about you, about understanding you, about trying." I want to be honest about what I felt when she said that. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even relief, exactly. It was something more complicated, something that didn't have a clean name. The feeling of watching a door you thought was closed turn out to be just unlocked. Not open. Unlocked. Still requiring a hand to push. I told her I would think about it. She made a sound that I recognized from when she was small, a sound she made when she was trying not to cry and winning by the thinnest margin. "Okay," she said. "That's okay." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The coffee was on again. Same kitchen window, same bare backyard oak. I had stood at this window and held a phone while she told me not to come. And now I had stood at this window and held a phone while she told me she was sorry. The window was the same window. The coffee was the same coffee. Everything in between was a year's worth of quiet work and one winter holiday spent alone and a number on a term sheet and a 34-year-old CEO pouring scotch in an office in San Francisco. None of it had happened in a dramatic way. None of it had been designed for effect. It had just been the honest accumulation of doing the work. In the weeks that followed, there were other calls. Thomas called to walk me through the royalty structure as Meridian's product moved toward its beta launch. Russell called to tell me that one of the two other firms he had originally contacted was still interested and wanted to discuss a separate licensing agreement for a different application of the same framework. The Meridian CEO, Nathan, sent me a message through Russell saying the technical team wanted to bring me in as a formal advisor, which was a different arrangement than the licensing deal and would be compensated separately. I had my attorney review all of it carefully. I did not rush. My son drove down from Denver the week before Christmas. He showed up at my door on a Saturday afternoon with a bottle of good wine and a slightly uncertain expression, and I let him in and we sat in the living room and talked for 4 hours. We talked about his mother. We talked about his work, which is in urban planning, and which I had never, I realized, asked him enough about. We talked about the years when he was small and I was not present enough, and the years after his mother died, when neither of us knew how to reach the other. He cried once, briefly, and then straightened up and apologized for it, and I told him not to apologize. He asked me about the framework, about the original methodology and how I had developed it and what it had taken to rebuild it. I explained it to him in non-technical terms, and I could see him listening with real attention, the kind of attention I had always hoped my children might give to my work and had mostly accepted they wouldn't. He asked good questions. He had always been a curious person. I had just not always been available to receive his curiosity. Near the end of the evening, he said, "I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer." I told him to ask. When Mom was alive, he said, did she know about the framework? About the original version? I thought about Sandra. About the early years, the late nights, the papers spread across the dining room table while she put the children to bed and brought me coffee at 10 p.m. without being asked. She typed the original documentation, I said. By hand, on a typewriter, because we didn't have a computer yet. Every page. He sat with that for a moment. She believed in it, he said. It wasn't a question. She believed in it, I said. He nodded slowly. Then I'm glad it worked out, he said. I'm really glad it worked out. Christmas was at my daughter's house. Her husband Marcus's family was there, his parents, his two sisters, their children. A full house, the way she had described it on that Sunday call. The house she had been managing the optics of when she told me not to come. I walked in on Christmas Eve, and Marcus greeted me at the door and shook my hand and said he was glad I was there. And something in the way he said it made me think my daughter had told him at least the outline of what had happened, and that he was a man who understood the outline without needing all the details. My daughter hugged me for a long time in the front hallway. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. We had said what we needed to say on the phone. The hug was the period at the end of that sentence. The evening was loud and warm in the way that houses are when they're full of people who are mostly comfortable with each other. I sat at dinner between Marcus's father, a retired school principal named George who had opinions about everything and delivered them without apology, and my granddaughter Lily, who is 7 and had recently decided that her most important goal in life was to learn every fact that exists about deep-sea fish. She told me about the anglerfish for 20 minutes while I ate my dinner, and I listened with complete attention. And at the end, she looked at me with some suspicion and said, "Do you actually think that's interesting, or are you just being polite?" I told her I genuinely thought it was interesting, and that the anglerfish was one of the more compelling examples of evolutionary pressure producing a solution to an extreme environment. She considered this. "You talk like a teacher," she said. I told her I had been one. "Were you good at it?" I told her I thought I had been, most of the time. She nodded and returned to her fish sticks with the air of someone who has completed a satisfactory evaluation. I looked down the length of the table, my daughter talking with Marcus's mother, my son and Marcus in a side conversation about something that was making them both laugh, George, the school principal, holding court at the far end, and I thought about Sandra. I thought about how she would have been right in the middle of it, threading between conversations, making everyone feel seen. I thought about what she would have thought about the deal, about the 14 months of quiet work, about the call at 11:47 p.m., and the apologies and the Christmas that had almost not happened. She would have said, "I told you so." She would have said it gently and with tremendous satisfaction, because she had told me, in dozens of different conversations over 30 years of marriage, that the work would matter, that the work was real, that the period of not being seen was not the same as having nothing to show. She was better at the long view than I was. She saw timelines that hadn't happened yet, and remained patient with them in a way that looked like faith but was actually something more rigorous than faith. It was trust based on evidence. I missed her that evening. I miss her every day. But there are evenings when the missing is sharper, more specific, not just the absence, but the exact shape of what's absent. The place at the table that stays empty, not because no one loves you, but because the one person who understood the whole story is gone. After dinner, the children went to bed, and the adults sat in the living room with wine, and the conversation became the quieter, slower kind. At some point, Marcus's father, George, said, unprompted, that he had read the Build Tech article and wanted to understand what I had actually built. So I explained it. I explained it in the same non-technical terms I had used with my son, the problem, the solution, why the solution was 40 years old, and why it had taken this long to become what it became. George listened with the focused attention of a man who spent 30 years making children understand things they didn't think they were capable of understanding. When I finished, he said, "The university lost something when you retired." I told him I appreciated that. "No," he said, "I mean it specifically, not as a compliment, as a fact. Those students don't know what they didn't get." I looked at my daughter across the room. She was looking at me with an expression I didn't have a word for, something between pride and apology and something else, something that was neither of those, and both of them the expression of a person revising a long-held understanding in real time. I thought about what she had asked me on the phone. "Are you okay?" Not the deal, not the article. You. "Are you okay?" I hadn't fully answered that question then. I was still in the middle of answering it. The thing about being 63 is that you have, if you've paid any attention at all, accumulated enough losses to know that what you have right now is temporary. Not in a morbid way, just as a fact, the way the frame of a building is a fact and the load it carries is a fact. The question is never whether the weight will shift. The question is whether you built the structure to handle the shifts with integrity, whether the framework holds. I thought about that framework, about the 40 years it had existed only in my head and in Sandra's typed pages, and in the practice of my daily work. About the 14 months I had spent alone at my desk, rebuilding it, not knowing what would come of it, not even being entirely sure something would. About the evening in Russell's coffee shop, when he told me what it was worth, and I wrapped my hands around my cup and looked out at the street and thought about a door that had not been open and was now open. I thought about my daughter's tired sigh, about the word difficult, about the specific unkindness of being told you are too much by people who are supposed to be where you belong. I thought about the fact that I had not built the framework in order to prove anything to them. That was important. I had built it because it was unfinished, and I was still alive, and the work was real. Everything else, the deal, the article, the late-night phone call, the Christmas invitation, was the consequence of the work, not its purpose. On Christmas morning, I woke up early in the guest bedroom of my daughter's house. The house was still quiet. I got up and went downstairs and made coffee and stood at her kitchen window looking out at her backyard, which has a maple tree she planted the year Lily was born. The sun was coming up flat and pale over the rooftops. The maple was bare, not the same as my oak, different tree, different yard, different morning, but the same pale light, the same bare branches, the same coffee smell, the same standing at a window being honest with yourself about where you are and what you have. My daughter came downstairs at 7. She found me at the window and stood beside me for a moment without saying anything, and we both looked at the maple tree in the early light. Then she said, "I'm sorry I told you not to come." I told her I knew. "I'm going to do better," she said, not as a promise with conditions, just as a statement of intention, offered plainly. I told her I was going to try to do better too. She poured herself a coffee and stood beside me, and we listened to the house begin to wake up around us, footsteps overhead, a child's voice, the specific morning of Christmas restlessness of a 7-year-old who has been awake since 5 and has been very patient about waiting. In a few minutes, Lily would come downstairs at full speed, and the day would become what Christmas days become, loud and generous and briefly exhausting, and then, later, settled into the long, quiet afternoon that is the best part of any holiday. I thought about Sandra again, about what she would have made of all of it, the call, the months alone, the work, the deal, this kitchen, this morning. I thought about what she would have said. She would have said, "Now, start from here." That was her phrase for a certain kind of moment. Not forgiveness exactly, not forgetting just the decision to begin the next part from wherever you were standing. She applied it to arguments, to mistakes, to the specific cruelty that families practice on each other out of exhaustion and assumption, and the failure to keep seeing clearly. Start from here, not from where things went wrong, not from where they should have gone right. From here, this morning, this kitchen, this coffee, this bare maple tree. I was not sure I was ready for that. I was not sure what ready meant, or whether it was a prerequisite. I only knew that I was standing in my daughter's kitchen on Christmas morning, that the work was done and had become what it was meant to become, and that the people I had thought I'd lost were in this house, asleep in their beds, and that the distance between us was not as fixed as I had begun to believe. Whether that was enough to build on, I couldn't say yet. I picked up my coffee and I thought, maybe it was.